Have you ever stopped to think, like, who actually controls what pops up on your feed? Or, what you're even allowed to say online? These discussions you have in this digital world we're all in, these aren't just abstract ideas anymore. They're really practical, personal even. So today we're doing a fascinating deep dive. We're looking at a pretty hefty report just out from the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. It's dated July 25, 2025. And, well, the title alone tells you something. The Foreign Censorship Threat, How the European Union's Digital Services Act Compels Global Censorship and Infringes on American Free Speech. So our mission really is to unpack this thing. It's dense. We want to pull out the key bits, the really important takeaways, so you can get a better handle on how laws from, other places might actually shape what happens online globally. Even right here, we're trying to get past the noise.
That's exactly it. And what this report lays out very forcefully is this argument that the EU's Digital Services Act, the DSA, is effectively being used as a censorship tool. And crucially, the claim is it's going way beyond just regulating bad stuff in Europe. The report argues it's hitting online speech everywhere, including having pretty significant impacts in the United States.
Right. And before we dive into the real nitty-gritty, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors. They make this deep dive possible. Big thanks to www.compliancehub.wiki. Seriously, if you need to navigate compliance stuff online, it's your go-to hub. And also to www.myprivacy.blog, fantastic resource for insights on digital privacy. Honestly, both are super useful for figuring out your place in this whole online world. Okay, let's get into it. The report starts right off by, questioning what the EU says the DSA is about. So what are the EU's official goals here, and what does this U.S. report claim is really going on?
Well, publicly, the EU's stance has always been pretty clear. DSA is Europe only, and it's focused on harmful or illegal content within its borders. Simple, right. But this U.S. report says it dug up non-public documents. And these documents, according to the committee, they show something different. They suggest European regulators are actually using the DSA to go after core political speech that isn't harmful or illegal. And they're allegedly pressuring the big platforms, mostly American ones, TikTok, X, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, to change their content rules globally. The report basically frames it as stepping on American free speech online.
Okay, so that's the reported practice. But stepping back, what is the DSA, legally? What's the basic structure?
So the act itself passed back in 2022. The core idea is that the biggest online platforms, the ones they call very large online platforms, are VLOPs.
VLOP, right.
Yeah, VLOPs. They have to find and mitigate what the law calls systemic risks on their services. Now, systemic risks, that's defined really broadly. It covers misleading or deceptive content, disinformation, anything that could negatively affect civil discourse and electoral processes, hate speech, and this is a key one, information which is not illegal.
Information which is not illegal, that just jumps out, doesn't it? Yeah. How does the report connect that regulating stuff that's perfectly legal to censorship?
That's a central point in the report. It argues that when you tell platforms they have to mitigate vague things like disinformation or hate speech, what that often means in practice is, censoring users. The committee's view is that governments, including the EU, can sort of weaponize these terms, use them to shut down political opponents, criticism, even like memes and jokes if they don't like the message. The definition of harmful becomes, flexible.
And if the platforms don't play ball, what happens then? What are the teeth here?
Oh, the teeth are sharp. The penalties are pretty massive. The report calls them dissuasive, which feels like an understatement. Fines can go up to 6% of a company's global annual revenue.
6%? Wow.
Yeah, 6% of worldwide income. And in what they call extraordinary circumstances, like a serious threat to public security or health in the EU, regulators could even order a temporary shutdown of the platform within the EU. The report is really explicit. These penalties are so big, they basically force companies not to allow speech that might otherwise be okay under free speech ideas.
Okay, so the financial pressure is immense. But does the DSA have other ways to kind of nudge platforms towards censorship? Beyond just the threat of fines, the report mentions specific mechanisms, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. The committee points to a few key things in the law itself. First, there's Article 21. This says platforms have to let certified third-party arbitrators handle disputes about content moderation. But here's the kicker, according to the report. These arbitrators don't necessarily have to be independent from the regulators who certify them. Plus, if the platform loses the arbitration case, they pay the cost. So the report argues there's a built-in incentive to just take stuff down beforehand to avoid the hassle and expense.
That makes sense. And what about these trusted flaggers? That sounds kind of ominous.
Right, that's Article 22. It basically tells platforms they have to give priority treatment to take down requests from these special government-approved groups called trusted flaggers. The report flags that many of these groups are openly pro-censorship and sometimes even get government funding. So the argument goes, they may be incentivized to flag speech, critical of politicians or, the government line. It names a few examples: Somas Enterprises in Finland, Eon False and Point de Contact in France getting state support. And it mentions Hate Aid in Germany. Another trusted flagger is apparently in a legal fight with X right now.
So you've got potentially biased flaggers pushing for takedowns and platforms scared into complying. What's the main obligation for the big guys, the VLOPs themselves, under the DSA?
That really comes down to Articles 34 and 35. That's the risk assessment and mitigation framework. Platforms have to constantly look for and deal with those systemic risks we talked about. And again, it's broad. Misleading content, disinformation, effects on civil discourse, hate speech, even if it's not illegal. The report emphasizes that the law specifically tells platforms to watch out for information which is not illegal.
It really sounds like the default action becomes removal, doesn't it, rather than maybe adding a label or context. Does the report explain why the push seems to be in that direction?
Exactly. The analysis in the report suggests that, while maybe labeling is possible, the whole structure, the penalties, everything pushes towards just taking the content down. And then you have these supposedly voluntary codes of conduct under Article 45. They cover things like hate speech, disinformation. The report notes that if platforms sign up and follow these codes, it acts like a kind of safe harbor protection against tougher DSA enforcement. So there's a huge incentive to join these codes, which often add more requirements, like the disinformation code making platforms use third-party fact-checkers.
You keep saying supposedly voluntary or allegedly voluntary. What's the deal there? Is the report saying they aren't really voluntary?
That's precisely the claim. The report states that non-public emails they got show the European Commission repeatedly and deliberately leaned on platforms that were hesitant to join these codes. The example they really focus on is X. X left the code on disinformation in May 2023, apparently because it didn't like the mandatory third-party fact-checker part. Well, according to the report, less than 2 months after the DSA rules kicked in legally, the Commission opened an investigation into X for using its own system, Community Notes, instead. And now, X is reportedly facing a potential fine of over $1 billion.
$1 billion? Wow.
Yeah. So the report uses this to argue that, look, even if they call these codes voluntary, not playing along has massive consequences. They're effectively mandatory.
Okay, so the report paints a picture where, as it says, on paper the DSA is bad, in practice it is even worse. What kind of specific speech does the report claim regulators are targeting based on these documents they got?
Based on the subpoena documents, the report claims European censors are going after core political speech that is neither harmful nor illegal. It mentions specific attempts to clamp down on debates about things like immigration and environmental policy. And it also alleges the censorship isn't neutral. It claims it's largely one-sided, almost uniformly targeting political conservatives. That's a direct claim from the committee's report.
Okay, that's a strong claim. Is there a really concrete example in the report that makes this clear?
They highlight one event in particular, a DSA multi-stakeholder workshop on May 7, 2025. Apparently, this was a more secretive meeting than usual. Commission officials privately told platforms what they expected in terms of censorship. And in one exercise they ran, there was a hypothetical social media post. It just said, "We need to take back our country." Now, the report points out that's a phrase you hear all over the political map in the U.S. Kamala Harris used it, Elizabeth Warren, Donald Trump. Pretty standard political talk. But at this EU workshop, the Commission explicitly labeled that phrase illegal hate speech that platforms must censor. That interpretation of such a common phrase is what the report finds really alarming.
Wow. Yeah, you hear that all the time. To label that illegal hate speech, that's quite a leap. What else came out of that workshop regarding content types?
Well, the materials from that workshop, according to the report, also make it clear that humor and satire are top censorship targets. There was apparently a specific question asking platforms how their content moderation processes could address memes that may be used to spread hate speech or discriminatory ideologies. They were also asked how to handle AI-generated content in that same context. And the report notes that civil society groups at the workshop, many described as pro-censorship and getting government funds, were pushing platforms to censor beyond just illegal stuff, to remove everything that could be considered as hateful and harmful.
So this clearly isn't just about what happens inside the EU's borders, is it? What does the report say this means for people in the U.S., for global speech?
This really gets to the heart of the report's concerns about global reach. Those non-public workshop documents apparently show Commission regulators expecting platforms to change their global terms and conditions to meet DSA rules. Since most big social media companies have one set of rules worldwide, it's just easier operationally. The report argues the DSA effectively requires platforms to change content moderation policies that apply in the United States and apply EU-mandated standards to content posted by American citizens.
But is it even feasible for platforms to have different rules everywhere? Like, could they just block EU users from seeing certain things?
The report argues, probably not effectively. Trying to maintain separate policies geographically would mean using stuff like geo-blocking, blocking content based on location. That's technically complex, invasive because it needs location data, which raises privacy issues, and it's easily beaten by VPNs anyway. Plus, the report points out, regulators in places like Australia and Brazil have already ordered global takedowns or threatened fines if people use VPNs to get around blocks. So, the committee concludes the DSA was designed to have global effects, and they say EU regulators even admitted this internally, worrying about spillovers of American speech into Europe if policies weren't aligned globally.
So it's not just theory. The report found actual examples of takedown demands from individual EU countries, too.
Exactly. The DSA gives national authorities power to issue quick censorship orders. The report details 3 examples they found via subpoenas. First, Poland, November 2024. Their National Research Institute ordered TikTok to remove a post saying electric cars are neither ecological nor an economical solution. The report calls this basic political speech. Second, France, 2023. After a terror attack by a refugee, French police told X to take down a satirical post from a U.S. account that was critical of French immigration policy. And third, Germany, December 2024. German authorities flagged a tweet calling for deportation of criminal aliens as incitement to hatred, basically telling X it had to go.
And the big worry is that these orders from one country could end up applying worldwide.
That's the argument, yes. The report points to a major European Court of Justice ruling from 2019, Glovishnik-Pichek v. Facebook. That case established that individual EU countries can issue orders for global content removal. So the report suggests the threat of global censorship isn't just from the top EU level, but potentially from any member state, which really amplifies the DSA's potential impact far beyond Europe.
This report is definitely painting a pretty concerning picture. What does it say is the fundamental idea, the philosophy behind the DSA? According to the committee, what's driving it?
The report puts it quite bluntly. It says the DSA is premised on a faulty reading of history. It argues the whole law rests on this idea that government cannot trust citizens to freely decide what is true or to handle online content that might offend them. It essentially labels it anti-speech Big Brother legislation. The goal, according to the report, isn't just regulation, but actively trying to shape and control online conversations around the world.
And it specifically calls out an anti-American bias. Is that part of the argument?
Yes, that's a very specific claim the committee makes. The report argues the DSA is specifically anti-American and deliberately designed to burden U.S. tech companies with heavy regulations while letting European competitors innovate more freely. They point to the threshold for being a VLOP, 45 million monthly users. The report claims this number was chosen somewhat arbitrarily to catch major American platforms, but exclude most European ones, like Booking.com or Spotify. Apparently Spotify used some kind of workaround. And they link the DSA to the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, arguing that both laws are basically tools the EU is using to kneecap American tech.
So after laying all this out, what's the committee's final word? What's the ultimate conclusion of this report?
In no uncertain terms, the report concludes the DSA is a powerful censorship law, one that gives European regulators the power to suppress speech they don't like, not just in Europe, but globally. It forces platforms into a choice, either adopt the EU Commission's view on acceptable speech or face crippling fines. And the report stresses this directly impacts things like humor, satire, and core political speech, things it calls hallmarks of free expression protected by the U.S. First Amendment. It wraps up by calling the DSA a new European censorship regime that fundamentally breaks from centuries-old principles of free speech that serve as the foundation of modern-day liberal democracies. It's a very strong condemnation.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive into the Judiciary Committee's report really does show just how complex and, frankly, contested the whole landscape of online speech regulation is becoming. It definitely makes you think about who gets to draw the lines in our global digital space.
It absolutely raises a huge question, doesn't it? In a world this connected, can different places really maintain separate standards for free speech? Or do global platforms inevitably end up defaulting to the rules of the most restrictive places they operate in? It's a massive challenge.
Yeah, definitely a lot to chew on there about who decides what you see, what you can say, especially when international rules get involved. We really hope digging into this report helps you feel a bit more clued in and maybe sparks some more questions for you about where all this is heading. And we absolutely have to thank our sponsors again.
Yeah.
www.compliancehub.wiki, your essential resource for compliance info. And www.myprivacy.blog for great insights on digital privacy. Their support is what lets us do these deep dives into really critical global topics like this one. Thanks for joining us. Tune in next time on The Deep Dive for another exploration into the most important nuggets of knowledge.